The SR-71 was the most incredible aircraft built in the 20th century. Not only the way it was built, but what it did. But the only thing more amazing than that airplane is that I actually got to fly it. That story is as amazing as the construction of that airplane, at least to me. Well, one day, I got shot down and I thought at 24 years old my life was going to end and I was going to be all done as a lieutenant and hit the ground and crash and blow up and die. And it's a very sobering morning for me. And I will tell you that your life does flash before your eyes at the last minute and you think, well, gosh, I didn't live enough life and I didn't do enough. I was only a lieutenant. I only flew for a couple of years. And here I am. I'm going to be in some no man's land place in the middle of nowhere near Cambodia and no one will ever know. Well, I closed my eyes tightly, clenched my fist, and I thought, well, it'll all be over in a flash. Painlessly, it'll be a fireball. I'll wake up in heaven, and it'll be over. Next thing I remember was a great deal of fire, and smoke, and heat, and flames all around me. And I thought, well, maybe I didn't go the way I thought I was going to go. Quickly realizing I was still alive, I got out of the airplane, and if you want heroes in my story, it's the Special Forces people that came to rescue me. They got me out of there, and it was just an amazing day for me. They couldn't get a chopper down there. Finally, we got an Army helicopter on frequency, and as you know, you can talk Army people to just about anything if you try. We got him down there, and he said, I can't put it down. There's not enough rotor clearance. I'll lose my crew. And I'm thinking, what more could go wrong today? And I'm laying there, and these guys are hovering over me with their weapons, and finally, the guy got on the radio and said, you either put it down or we'll shoot it down. And I thought, well, I am on the right team of players here. And they finally said, we think we can put it down. Got me on the chopper, got me out of there, got me back to Okinawa. They said, well, he's not going to make the trip across the Pacific, so let him go to Kadena, let him die there, we'll stick his body home in the box. And that was the plan for me. They sent a 9-man burn team out of Fort Sam Houston, Texas, all the way to Okinawa just for me. 9 people worked for 2 months on me to keep me alive and see if they could save me. And they did. That was not a very pleasant experience. I cursed them daily. And in that 2 months, my body went from 180 pounds of raw muscle and steel, as you see today, to 119 pounds. I was at 119 and a quarter. And they said, if you lose another quarter pound, we can't save you. My body was rejecting food. I was about to die. I just couldn't do it. And in fact, and this is the part I hate most in my presentation, I have to admit to you, I gave up and wanted to quit. And I'm an inspirational speaker today. I go all over the world. And I have to admit, or I'd be a liar, to say I was tough, brave, courageous. Oh no. Sometimes you have to reach rock bottom before you can appreciate the journey. And I wanted to quit. And I thought of all the bad things I'd ever done in my entire life. But that took a week. And, 2 weeks. And I said, I don't know, God, please, God, let me just die. I can't do this. It's just too much. Big, tough, brave fighter pilot said, no, I've had it. That's it. I can't fight this anymore. I don't have any strength left. Well, there's a turning point to every story. Mine's kind of a silly thing, but yet it's kind of an important thing about attitude and how we think. One day I was laying there at 119 and a quarter. And I said, God still wasn't listening. He let me live through another day of agony. And I saw that out the 3rd floor window, I could see the soccer field there at Kadena, and the kids were playing soccer. It was April. And I could hear them laughing and kicking the ball and playing. And I thought, boy, how was those kids at one time? And right at that moment, Judy Garland came on the radio singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. What are the odds? How many of you know the words to that song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow? Anybody? No, you don't. Put your hands down. You think you do? I thought I did. It's the Wizard of Oz kid song. It's a happy song. Oh, no, that is not a children's song. That is an adult philosophical song. If you listen to the words of that song, it's about daring to dream. And why can't I fly? There's a lot of deep meaning in that song. That I heard that song for the first time that day. The words penetrated my brain sharper than any scalpel the surgeons were using. And I could look out the window and see the other side of the rainbow and those kids. And I made a choice. I made a decision. It wasn't the song. It wasn't Judy Garland. It wasn't the Wizard of Oz. It was just, I made a choice. That song reminded me of when I was a kid and I had a good attitude and a positive joy of life. And And I said, I'm going to try to eat the food tomorrow, even if I never fly again or never walk right again. They're going to amputate these 2 fingers. They already told me. I don't care. I'm going to try and have a better attitude tomorrow. And isn't it amazing how a simple change in attitude can change the whole rest of your life? And I just made that choice that day. And they came in the next morning all ready to feed me, and they could see I had fire in my eyes, which is probably a very bad pun at this stage of the story. And they said, okay. I said, I'm going to try now. I'm going to try to, and the food would not go down. My body rejected it. And they were beside themselves. And they go, oh, God, what are we going to do? We want to, nothing. Finally, one Navy guy that worked there, his wife packed him a sack lunch. He said, well, maybe you could eat something out of my sack lunch, anything that maybe could go down. Nothing, except a little plastic container of cherry Kool-Aid. And the cherry Kool-Aid went down real smooth. They ran to the commissary and they got every pack of cherry Kool-Aid they could find. I drank 3.2 gallons of cherry Kool-Aid the first day. I lived on 4 to 5 gallons of Kool-Aid a day for 5 days. I peed real good. And they said that's even a better sign. His body's functioning. He has no internal injuries at all. He's young. He could live. He could get through this. Next, some saltine crackers, some bread. Next thing you know, I'm on a plane back to Fort Sam Houston, Texas. Spent a year there, went through all these surgeries. The Air Force said, well, I'll never fly again, and he'll live, but he won't. I'm not going to bore you with that whole story today. You have to wait till the movie comes out. I'm sure, Matt Damon or someone's gearing up for that role. But the point is, there came a day when I was released from the hospital and I could pass a flight physical, which is a miracle in itself. And I did. And they said, wow, it's a miracle. And the Air Force said, wow, we're not ready to have him back. We don't know what to do with him. But I want to tell you, there came a day when I stood on the steps of that hospital and I was leaving. And I got to go back to the Air Force. And I knew 2 very important things at that moment. And I want to share them with you today. Number 1, life is short and it's uncertain. And because it's both, how can we possibly miss the opportunity that each day is? Number 2, live your passion, live your dream now, don't wait. Because of rule number 1. Pretty simple philosophy, but it was ingrained in me deeply. I went back to the Air Force and I felt like I'd been reborn. I was starting over as a 2-year-old. It's like a 2-year-old. And I was just like that fearless little kid that didn't care anymore about all the stuff that we care about that stops us from doing stuff. And I went back to the Air Force, and I will tell you the Air Force was not ready to have a 2-year-old come running back to the fighter cockpit. Makes colonels very nervous, that 2-year-olds flying their jets. And I came back to the Air Force. I was flying A-7s. I got an A-10, first A-10 squadron. I was on the first A-10 demo team. I was flying F-5s, doing all this stuff. And I was teaching at the weapons school, like our Top Gun school, one day, and I decided I'd like to fly the world's fastest jet. Now, you already know this, but I'm going to tell you this. The world is filled with negative no people. You know, the people that are going to tell you why you can't do something, and if they'd spent all that energy helping you, you could have already done it. The Air Force was always like, well, you know, you got all this scar tissue, and we're not sure you can. First they told me that I couldn't fly fighter jets because of the G loading. Then we found out scar tissue gave me a higher G tolerance because the blood pooled in there, and I actually was like I had a built-in G suit. It was great. Then when I wanted to apply for this program, they said, well, we don't think you should do that because you have to wear a spacesuit and breathe 100% oxygen all the time, and you know, you got that scar tissue thing going on. I'd look at them and say, hey, guess what? I went into surgery 15 times in the hospital, and they were giving me 100% oxygen all the time. So I think it's going to be okay. The Air Force just didn't know what to do with me. Well, when I got to this program, I was 12. I was a 12-year-old. And I would like to share with you this morning the adventures of a 12-year-old flying the world's fastest jet. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the SR-71 was your guardian of freedom for a quarter of a century, serving 6 different presidents, did more to win the Cold War than you could ever imagine. The airplane was 107 feet long, carried a crew of 2, a pilot and navigator. The airplane flew at 3 times the speed of sound, or roughly 2,100 miles an hour. If you fired your hunting rifle, the bullet would exit the muzzle at 3,100 feet per second. This aircraft would cruise in a climb with ease at 3,200 feet per second. The airplane would cruise around at 80 to 90,000 feet. I could read your t-shirt, words on your t-shirt from 90,000 feet if you're standing outside. The airplane was a one-of-a-kind, built of titanium to withstand the 900-degree Fahrenheit heat that built up on the jet at those speeds. Only 93 men in history got to fly missions in this jet. I always said that I appreciated it more than the other 92. The airplane was a one-of-a-kind. It was a reconnaissance vehicle that had no weapons at all, carried 80,000 pounds of fuel that had burned through in about an hour and a half. The jet carried a double sonic boom. It was no secret to the Soviets or the enemy when they were flying over. You're not going to hide that kind of heat source. It didn't matter. You were higher, faster than what they could shoot down. Not one was ever shot down in its entire history. The 2 cockpits were radically different in this airplane, so you were crewed up with a specific backseater, and you flew with him all the time. Because you each had to learn how to communicate very efficiently between cockpits when things went wrong. They left you in the simulator for 6 months before they let you actually go out and start flying the jet. I was crewed up with Major Walt Watson. He's the one on the left. Walter had the distinction of being the only black officer in Air Force history to be a part of this prestigious program. So here we were, the burned up guy and the black guy. It's like everybody knew who we were. We didn't want that kind of notoriety. But Walt and I became very good friends. We're best friends to this day. We email all the time. You saw that in the beginning, Spy Pilot Chronicles. We do a show once a year where the 2 of us get on stage and he comes out and says, "Let me tell you what it's like to fly with a 12-year-old. Everybody just loves the guy, you know. But no, he was a brilliant engineer, and you needed a guy like that in the back seat. We wore the same spacesuit as the shuttle astronauts did. First time I got in the cockpit, I said, "Whoa, it's not all that cosmic or modern. That is a Century Series 60s style cockpit. Nothing real magic in there. You know what kind of radar we had? We didn't have any radar. You know what kind of computers we had? There were no computers in the airplane. Airplane was a very ancient 50s, 60s mentality. They had to invent technology to build this airplane. Read Kelly Johnson's book on the skunk, Ben Rich's book on the Skunk Works. It's amazing that they could even build this back in those days, pre-computer, pre-composite days. The airplane, like I said, the first time I got in the cockpit, I said, well, there's no guns, bombs, or rockets. I feel a little naked. And I figured, well, at least there's maybe a camera switch I could flip to turn the camera. No, there was not one at all. In fact, the first time I got in there, I didn't really know what I was doing.
Anything else I can tell you? Yeah. How do you start this thing?
Yeah, there was a few questions we had to start with. I told Walt, hey, you got all the secret stuff in the back. You got all the cameras, sensors, all the comm jamming, all the navigation stuff. I said, if we're ever shut down, you're the spy, I'm just the driver. My job was to keep the pointy end forward. And that was a full-time job in this airplane. Now, getting used to the helmet did take a little bit. They always told you, now if you're a fighter pilot, you can take your mask off in flight, scratch your face or wipe sweat out of your eye, or if you're a Navy pilot, pick your nose or whatever it is that they do. But now you were entombed for 4 to 6 hours, breathing 100% oxygen. You can't scratch your face or wipe sweat out of your eye, and sometimes that became a little uncomfortable. They also said, watch what you eat before you go. You don't want a gassy breakfast because, as you know, the higher in elevation that you go, the more the evolved gases in your body expand. Well, and those of you that have hiked in Lake Tahoe behind the guy that ate a plate of beans for breakfast know what happens as you go higher. Well, I was a new guy that were kind of playing with me one day, and I was going on my first long mission, and they said, Brian, have the ham and cheese omelet in the in-flight kitchen. In fact, put extra cheese on there because the protein will be good for you. And I'm thinking, well, that makes sense. Cheese, protein, pile it on. Went on my first mission there, and passing 55,000 feet in the climb, I thought I was going to give live birth in the cockpit. Walter's going, what's wrong? Are you okay? I'm hearing all the sounds up there. And at 70,000 feet, when relief finally came, I very tearfully realized just how self-contained that entire environmental system was. Now let's face it, it's a lot more fun to be in the front seat. You have a stick, you can fly the airplane. There's no stick in the back seat. The guy can't fly the airplane. He's got his head down, he's working on stuff, and you need a good guy back there, but it's a little more fun in the front with the view. So if you look at our spacesuits here, here's Walt and I getting ready to go on a real mission. Mine has kind of a happy face on it because we're going to fly. Walter's, Now we only flew out of 3 locations around the world: Okinawa, England, and Beale Air Force Base just up here in Northern California. We had 2 jets in England, 2 jets in Okinawa, and a dozen airplanes in Beale. That was it. We were out of the country maybe 6 months out of the year, rotating between locations. This is Okinawa, getting ready to go up to North Korea. Sonic boomed their little shorts off. They could use that today. Carried our double sonic boom up there, and Ronald Reagan was our commander-in-chief at the time, and he knew how to use this airplane in a good way. One day the Koreans had a communist conference in North Korea, and they invited all the bad guys, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Russians. They were all there. They didn't invite us. Ronald Reagan said, have Brian and Walter take off out of Kadena, flying up to Korea, do a little figure-8 butterfly pattern there over the... And we're going, what are we doing? We have photographed the entire country in the first 5 minutes. Well, it's Ronald Reagan's way of every 5 minutes, sonic booming their coffee cup off the table, just to let them know that we know you're there, now you know we're here, and you can't do a thing about it. Over 4,500 missiles were fired at this jet in 25 years. Not one piece of one was ever hit. Little footnote to history here that you may not know. Behind the jet here is the Kadena Marina, where the Navy has a little officers club. People are windsurfing and sailing and learning how to windsurf. And rumor has it, I don't know how true this is, that some SR-71 pilots on takeoff would suck the wheels up 10 feet off the deck and full blower go ripping across that marina, knocking windsurfers over. And I just think that's just a rumor personally. This is one of my favorite pictures here. There's a photo you will never get. On the runway, doing an engine run and leaning over that nose wheel strut. You see the heat in the back on an active runway in a cold winter day in England. That must have been taken by a Time Life photographer or somebody knew what they were doing. Nope. I was taken by a 12-year-old that still couldn't figure out what the word aperture on his camera meant. Let's go back a minute. Let's review. What 2 things did we learn in life? Life is short and it's uncertain. 2, live your passion, follow your dream. Mine was photography and flying jets. Well, I was around the most elegant aircraft ever built. I'm going to want to take pictures of it. Now it's top secret, no cameras, top secret, but there were ways to do it if you got enough approval, enough paperwork signed, kind of a pain in the butt to do. But if that's your passion, the photos that you're seeing in this show this morning represent the world's rarest collection of SR-71 photographs. They are all my own pictures. Now, was I a great photographer? No way. I didn't have a clue what the word aperture on my camera meant. I was still fumbling with it. And how did I get this picture? One day I'm sitting in the mobile car with the colonel, and we're watching the engine run. In just moments, that jet's going to take off, fly over the polar ice cap and somewhere into northern Russia and East Germany, and do a whole big loop around the European theater. And we're mesmerized by the sound of this jet. And he looks over, he said, what's that camera doing on the seat? You know you're not supposed to have a camera out here. And I go, huh? What? Camera? Then the noise of the jet just gets our attention, and we were staring at the airplane. And I said, you know, Colonel, if you had a picture like that in your office, you'd be like the only one that would have that. And he never really looked at me, and his lips never moved, but I distinctly heard, you have 10 seconds. Leaped out of the car. To this day, I can still feel the cold, hard runway in England there, that frozen concrete. And I fumbled with the camera. In 10 seconds, I took 2 pictures on Kodachrome slides. I figured, well, just try different apertures. Maybe those numbers mean higher beats better. Who knows? Got both wingtips in, one of the rare times I got it in. And I tell that story because today I look at that picture and it's a marvelous picture. The lighting by God is perfect. The jet is magnificent and it's framed correctly and it worked. And the point is not that, oh, look at me, I'm a photographer. The point is don't miss the moment in life out of fear that you don't know what you're doing. People are so afraid to live their dream because, people laugh at me, or I don't know how to do it very well, or I'm not very good at it. No, don't miss the moment. We can never, ever go back and get that picture again. If you never heard one take off, your life's incomplete, I'm sorry. It was a sound you did not hear as much as feel as the decibels penetrated your body. Every day at Beale, but for 25 years it was a normal routine. Start, taxi, take off, doing mission, training missions, tankers out there for your air refueling. Climbing out over Northern California, over Susanville. There's Mount Lassen in the background. We're in a Chase aircraft. The T-38 is a magnificent airplane to fly up next to and try to keep up with. If you're going to go that fast, you're going to burn a lot of fuel. You're going to have to do this operation 2 to 5 times on a mission. Not so bad on a nice sunny day, straight level. You try this at night, in a turn, in turbulence, in a storm, with lightning in your face. And I'll tell you, they don't pay you enough, but you have to get the gas or the mission is not going. There's a rare view you'll never see of an air refueling operation from above. As most of you know, acrobatics are illegal in air refueling operations. So only an idiot or a 12-year-old would get a picture like that. On my days off, I would try to go up on the tanker. Guys would say, what's wrong with you? It's your day off. Why would you want to go up with the boom operator just to get a picture of the jet? And I'm thinking, well, hey, we're the only people in the whole world that get to be around this airplane. Why wouldn't you want to do that? It was my passion. I just wanted to do it. They said, you're going to orbit up there for 6 hours just for 15 minutes of the excitement. I said, yeah? What's your point? And they said, well, it's such a big fat pain to get all the paperwork signed, get all the approval to do it. And I said, let me tell you something. Pain is laying in a burn ward where they're ripping skin off one part of your body to sew it on another part. And now you have a new wound you didn't even have one to start with. And you're sitting under a heat lamp all Saturday, letting that wound dry out while other people are out playing baseball. I said, that's pain. This is a joy. So, as a 12-year-old, I had a different perspective on life, and I realized I was surrounded by adults, and I couldn't communicate with them some days. But I went up, and I'm glad I did. Got some of the pictures like that. It's another one of those Rembrandt lighting pictures where you go, surely he knew what he was doing there. Not a clue. Not a clue. One day I was standing in the office in Kadena, and the commander, who was now sporting a beautiful picture on his wall, said, Brian, why don't you go up on the tanker today and see if you can get some pictures? And I said, well, sir, I think I will. Thank you. So I was up with the boom operator, and he says, I'll give you 10 seconds. Everybody only gave me 10 seconds. And if you've ever seen the boom pod in the tanker, you got to lean over. You can't really look through your viewfinder very well. These are manual cameras, line cranked, film, roll of 36. We're not talking digital here. And focus it and manually, and then try to figure out that damn aperture. What the hell does that thing do? I took 2 pictures that day, and that's a magnificent bit of lighting by God. Again, I have no credit taken there at all. You can see the fuel seeping out of the wing. The airplane was designed to actually leak. It grew 4 inches in flight. So it was cracking the titanium when it was new. This is one of those few pictures where you can actually see the fuel streaming out of the wing root there subsonically. When it heats up, the jet seals like Tupperware. You don't lose a drop of fuel. But I love that photograph. It almost became the cover shot to my book. It just lost out by a hair to the one that did. But I show these pictures, I'm in awe of the fact that I even took them, not because I knew what I was doing, but because I didn't miss the moment, and now I wish I'd taken 10,000 more. Little special treat for you coming out on a Saturday. We're going to show you a little start, taxi, takeoff routine of what a daily operation in Beale was like. In the background, you may hear Buick Wildcat V8 engines running up, and you'd be correct. That's what you're hearing because we used twin Buick Wildcats until they went over to the Chevy Big Block to crank that shaft over, dump fuel into the burner section, triethylborane chemical to ignite the fuel, because the fuel was non-flammable to withstand the heat. It was just an amazing start process. You'll see that in this film. It gives you just a little idea of what went on for the quarter of a century at Beale.